Welcome to the Social Exchange Podcast. This show is brought to you by you. Everything that you love about the show is true because of our patrons. Everything that you hate about the show is definitely not my fault. If you enjoy the Social Exchange Podcast, if you believe our message is important, and you want to keep it running in full form, you can donate at patreon.com. A donation as little as $2 per month goes a long way toward keeping things sustainable, buying new equipment, and considering advanced projects and creative new ways of providing you content. To donate, go to patreon.com/thesocialexchange. By the way, 25% of all donations go directly to Families for Sensible Drug Policy. So a donation through us helps both organizations. You can also make a one-time donation at PayPal. We'll leave the PayPal link in the description of this talk. And if you want to support in a huge way without spending $1, you can rate and review the show on iTunes, which enhances our relevance, I think they call it, searchability kind of, and helps us generate new listeners. And now we want to thank all of our Patreon supporters for your constant support, and I mean it when I say that having even a modest pool of donations goes a long way in keeping Aaron and me thinking about the future of the show and planning what we'll do next and just staying excited about it. So, huge thanks to Carter, Vermont. Carter, Vermont is a nonprofit organization run by Dr. Rick Barnett, helping people with addiction problems. Carter's the very first organization to become a sponsor. So thank you, Carter, Vermont, and thank you, Rick Barnett. Thank you to Earle, Inigo, Jon Holt, Layla Ferguson, Mary Kay Villaverde, Michelle, Nancy, Sean Holt, Regina Ferguson, Timmy Tucker, Christian, Thomas Rhodes, Kathleen Cochran, Marjorie Israel, Diane T., Trevor, and Sue Matthew. Again, become a supporter of the show. Go to patreon.com/thesocialexchange.
Before we join the shadow in today's adventure, here's the proposition.
Welcome to the Social Exchange Podcast. Number 4 of a segment that we call FSDP Presents. FSDP is Families for Sensible Drug Policy, a global coalition of families, professionals, and organizations representing the voice of families. FSDP advocates for comprehensive care and progressive solutions for family support based on science, compassion, public health, and human rights. On February 24th, join FSDP as they bring communities together for the 2019 International Family Drug Support Day. Find out more about International Family Drug Support Day, and then to learn more about Families for Sensible Drug Policy, visit fsdp.org. Again, fsdp.org. Today's guest is Dr. Andrew Tatarsky. Dr. Tatarsky is a psychologist. He's founder and director of the Center for Optimal Living, and he's author of the book Harm Reduction Psychotherapy. He also accepted an offer to be part of the FSDP Executive Board. Andrew's a true harm reduction pioneer, and I had a lot of fun talking with him about his career, his beliefs about psychology and addiction, and his plans for the foreseeable future. Now enjoy the show. I'm here with Dr. Andrew Tatarsky. Dr. Tatarsky, thank you so much for talking with me today.
It's an extreme pleasure for me to be here with you.
Well, of course, I want to talk about your work in the addiction field. You're on the Families for Sensible Drug Policy Advisory Board, thus the name of this segment, FSDP Presents, psychologist, founder and director of the Center for Optimal Living, and the author of the book Harm Reduction Psychotherapy, a new treatment for drug and alcohol problems. And so for this work in the addiction field and your dedication to harm reduction principles, you've really earned yourself a name among, the great pioneers and advocates for harm reduction in this country, even worldwide. So I want to get to all of this, but let's back up. Tell me about your background, especially if I missed anything here specifically, and how did you become interested in helping people with addiction-related problems in the first place?
There are kind of two parts to the story. The professional part was that as a young graduate student in psychology, I sort of coincidentally happened to get lots of patients and clients referred to me over the course of my training that had drug and alcohol problems. And, I think those early experiences were quite formative in that, growing up in a culture that has stigma about drug users and drug use steeped, throughout the culture, I, of course, had internalized a lot of that. And those early experiences were dramatic in challenging these kind of stigmatizing attitudes that I wasn't even really aware that I had, because I was introduced to this amazing group of diverse people who were suffering, but who were, committed to growth, who were creative, who had strengths, so that, I think, early experience, sparked my interest in this area. But also I became aware early on that certainly back then, and what I think is still the case today, it seemed to me that the treatment or the efforts at helping this group of people were abysmally inadequate and in many ways, damaging. And so I felt that here was an area that I might be able to actually make a positive contribution to, to improving, innovating, and so on. So even very early on, I had this kind of, sense of passion about the field. But however, as I was a college student and graduate student, I actually kind of paid my way through school by working part-time jobs in the developmental disabilities field. So I actually thought I was going to go into that specialty when I finished my training. And in fact, I did get a job in developmental disabilities, and before I started it, after my training, I saw this tiny little advertisement for a job as a counselor in an addiction treatment program up in East Harlem. And there was something about the ad that really drew my attention. And I called them up, I went for interviews, and they hired me. And that sort of early understanding was sort of the first story, that here was a field of undertreated folks where I might be able to make a positive contribution. Then as I worked through the field, over the first, I'd say, 8 years of my career, I worked as a counselor. I finally got my PhD. Then I actually worked as clinical director for a number of programs. But it was all in abstinence-only disease model treatment, because back then that was the only thing that, the only game in town, the only framework for doing this work.
When was this, by the way?
This was, my first job was in 1982. So I worked through a number of different jobs over the course of the 80s. And in fact, I was told when I entered the field, that I needed to throw out everything I had learned in graduate school about psychotherapy and about helping people, because, after all, with addicts, you got to do something entirely different. And that entirely different is the traditional abstinence-only treatment approach, which is sort of prescriptive. It's one size fits all. It's authoritarian. We tell people what to do. And then when they don't do it or they don't stop, we tend to become punitive in one way or another.
Right.
So it's actually not even a real sophisticated, evidence-based, even rational approach to helping people. But that was really the only framework. But over the course of those 8 years, I saw firsthand that actually most people weren't coming to our programs. Most people weren't sticking in the programs. Most people weren't stopping their drug use. And in fact, I found myself frequently doing things to patients that ultimately felt traumatizing to the patients and traumatizing to me. Asking people to leave treatment for using drugs, when they were in treatment for using drugs in the first place. So this is a long-winded way of kind of getting to the next part of my story. But so I began to critique the traditional approach. I began to think that the dominant model, the disease model, seemed to be wrong, and that this abstinence-only approach that is requiring abstinence for people to get into treatment and stay in treatment seemed to be the primary limiting factor. And so I happened to start a little private practice in the late 80s, and I figured the traditional approach isn't working. I'm going to break the rules. I'm just, going to work with active drug users and see if I can be of help. And lo and behold, many of them did incredibly well, which is the disease concept abstinence-only approach tells us that that's not possible. In your active addiction, you can't make use of psychotherapy.
Right. But the distinction there is that rather than making sure that people are not using drugs while you're giving them therapy, you're saying, well, Jesus, that doesn't make sense. This is the problem that they're here for, so we'll see them in their active lifestyles.
That's right. So I then had this accumulating experience that many active drug users made incredibly good use of therapy. Many of them cut back their use. Some of them stopped. They worked on other life issues. And so I'm in this quandary. The dominant approach isn't working. Breaking all the rules is. How do I make sense of this? I had the good fortune to have a personal relationship with somebody that we now think of as the godfather of harm reduction therapy, a man named Alan Marlatt.
Yeah.
I shared my quandary with him, and he said, Andrew, you're doing harm reduction. That was in 1994. So that moment introduced me to the harm reduction framework, and that was my spiritual reawakening, where I kind of saw the harm reduction framework as a set of principles that really could suggest or support a completely different way of setting up helping relationships. And that has really evolved into my approach to harm reduction therapy, which I call integrative harm reduction therapy. But about 10 years into that journey of developing integrative harm reduction therapy, in my own personal therapy, I made a connection that to an experience that I had when I was 15 years old, which I had completely really dissociated from. And that was that I had been in a non-residential therapeutic community drug program. When I was 14, I entered the program. When I was 15, I split the program because essentially, having broken a rule, I was completely traumatized by this program. I don't know how much you know about therapeutic communities, but I was humiliated. I was made to sit in the middle of a group, and with the group yelling at me, verbally attacking me, humiliating me. I mean, sort of the most disgusting kind of assault. And when I tried to fight back, they kind of upped the ante, brought more people into the room. And I ultimately came to feel that they actually wanted to break me. And that's sort of the theory of these places, break down the addict so that you can build them up in some, healthier way or something. But so at 10 months into the program, I realized that this was not a good place for me to be, and I split. That's what they call it. When you split, you become like persona non grata. I was completely excommunicated. So I was attacked by the staff. I was sort of betrayed and abandoned by my friends. And now I was all alone. But I kind of buried the experience. I moved on. And at this point in my own personal treatment, I realized that trauma had been working within me to bring me into the field, to sensitize me to its shortcomings and its problems, and to inspire me to develop this whole other approach to treatment. So, my experience is really one of how, these treatments can really traumatize people. And I started to talk about this a few years ago because I thought, what I experienced has been experienced by, hundreds of thousands or millions of people, and it's never really been identified and kind of owned in the field.
Sure.
And talked about in a way that I think can help people who have gone through this to begin healing. So, my story is about my own trauma, but also about how this kind of trauma can be, transformed into creative, constructive action, empowered action.
Yeah, so you noticed something in your own work with patients that reminded you, maybe subconsciously or tacitly, but also in some sense overtly, about your own experiences, and you knew you were doing something wrong. Now, I don't know you very well, but you seem to be a pretty agreeable guy for the most part, so doing something as risky and disagreeable as beginning a form of treatment that just went 90 degrees away from standard treatment models, that must have felt a little scary. Did you have periods of time where you worried about that when you were first starting out?
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that became increasingly clear to me is I had really suffered from extreme public speaking anxiety. So just think about this. I sort of stepped into being a critic of traditional treatment and beginning to talk openly in front of groups about this radical alternative that is, in a sense, almost turning traditional treatment completely upside down. And I would have this panic anxiety, which I think was one of the consequences of the trauma that I experienced, where I was in the drug treatment program being essentially attacked by this large group of people. So I didn't realize it at the time, but what I've come to understand is that I was like symbolically trying to find my voice, the voice that I had lost in that drug program, sort of speak my truth. So it was like a way of symbolically reworking, losing my voice and mastering this fear, and finding my truth and speaking it. So there were many, many years where, I would have to prepare and over-prepare, just in case, I had this kind of post-traumatic, brain freeze, which would happen to me sometimes. But I think that, I guess I'm a stubborn and what we call kind of counterphobic person. I really, didn't want to be defeated by this experience. So it was many years before I was able to really gain some mastery over it and feel a sense of freedom. But, in the last 2 years, I guess it was really 2.5 years ago, I was interviewed by a guy named William White, who is you know who he is?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, an addiction researcher and historian. On his website, he has a list of interviews that he calls pioneer interviews. So I was really honored to be invited to be one of the pioneers. And I decided, that just on the spur that I should begin talking about this then. And actually, since I've been talking about it over the last 2.5 years, that's been a kind of part of the ongoing process of really healing this traumatic experience at a deeper and deeper level.
It sounds like the process you went through in regaining traction in your own life, rediscovering value, getting some motivation, doing something purposefully in a gritty sort of way, despite the pushback that you get. It sounds like, you're living the experience you're trying to help people that you're working with discover for themselves. Would you say that's right, or is there something maybe different about that?
I think that that's absolutely right. And, and I think we can get into this in a bit more detail if you like, but I think that what I've come to as this kind of, this integrative harm reduction method, or it's a method that can be applied to psychotherapy, counseling, helping relationships. It can also be applied to family relationships. But I think it can also be applied to oneself. And I really do see that this is an approach that I use in my own life as a way to sort of support myself in moving forward and making positive change in my life. I've very much have learned mostly from my own personal experience, but certainly also from, the thousands of people who struggle with these issues, that I know something about because of my own personal experience. But, so that has been, one of the primary sources of information that has informed my work. But, we learn from, not only do we learn from our patients, our clients, our colleagues about how we're all similar, but we also recognize how everyone is entirely unique and has their own story, their own unique circumstances, their own histories. So that's what's so fascinating about being in a kind of helping, role.
Yeah, there's no real script that you can apply to somebody else's life without getting to know them first and understanding their life space.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So maybe you can define a little more. You said we could go into this. What is harm reduction psychotherapy? How does it differ from traditional psychotherapy, and how do you relate the two concepts?
Well, I think that the harm reduction philosophy has a particular meaning and a particular historical role and a particular radical, critical function in the addictive behaviors field, or in, and it particularly emerged out of working with people with problematic substance use. But I think it has really broad applicability to all risky and problematic behaviors. And it emerged really as a alternative and a corrective to the dominant abstinence-only philosophy. So abstinence only says that the only acceptable goal for a person who is supposedly is addicted, and I think we might even get into that, a critique of the concept of addiction, right, or what's problematic about it. But according to that disease model, the only acceptable goal is abstinence, and complete and total abstinence. And anything short of that is considered active addiction. So even if you have been, years abstinent and you have a drink, or you have a sip of a drink, you're considered to have relapsed. Your disease is reactivated, and you're back to square one.
Right. Right.
So it's like one story. It's what I think of as one addiction recovery story, which has dominated really the globe.
That there's a demon molecule nested inside of whatever drug you happen to use.
Well, the demon molecule interacts with your vulnerable biology, and now the brain disease people are saying then it hijacks your brain.
Yeah.
Like, where does it hijack it to? It carries it off into the forest or something.
Yeah, right.
Now, let me say, I'm in no way minimizing, the problematic aspects or the potential problematic aspects of problematic drug use. But the model is really problematic. What harm reduction offers as an alternative is it says, wait a minute, we can actually see that any positive change, either in the problem behavior or in the issues that are getting expressed through the problem behavior, that impact on the problem behavior, is a viable, wonderful positive change goal. It's a wonderful starting place, any positive change. So rather than saying that we have one acceptable goal, the harm reduction framework then says there are so many places where we can be focusing on making positive change, as a way to start the process or support people in starting the process. So, when we talk about substance use particularly, we can say that, there are many, many things we can do to make substance use safer or less risky. There are many strategies. There's information, there's education, there's support. There are safer using practices that people can learn. If you're a drinker, not getting behind the wheel of a car when you're drinking is a hugely valuable goal and achievement, as opposed to driving when you're drinking. We might also think about, within this harm reduction umbrella, reducing use and moderating use. And even if you choose to stop, if that's a goal that makes sense for you. So the harm reduction umbrella opens up a whole range of possibilities, that the abstinence-only approach shuts down or really doesn't honor, doesn't value. Now, it gets even more complex, because if we consider that problematic behavior is not just driven by the behavior or by that demon molecule, but there are multiple factors, that contribute to this. It has meaning for people. People engage in behaviors for reasons. We humans are not amoebas. Our behavior is steeped in multiple meanings. Identity, self-care, dealing with suffering, feeling pleasure, connecting with people. There are so many what we might call psycho-biosocial factors that get wrapped up with problematic behavior that anchor it, that may need to be addressed, identified, addressed before we can even address the problem behavior, specifically. Right. So the harm reduction framework makes room for that. Let's look at the motivations. Let's look at your relationships. Let's look at life circumstances. Let's look at how, our chaotic political and economic circumstances affect us. And that then contributing to why we may be prone to engage in risky behavior. So any positive change, any reduction in drug-related harm is a good thing and a place to start. Then small incremental change, rather than say, the only goal is stopping. Well, what if you just make a little change, in your use? Cut down a little, use a little more safely, take a little better care of yourself, start working on improving the quality of your relationships, right? So small positive changes in all of the related issues can have a positive impact on the problem behavior. And then I think finally, an essential value inherent in all harm reduction practice is empowerment, collaboration, respect, the quality of the relationship that the helping people have with the people that they're trying to help or wanting to help. So rather than punitive, authoritarian, prescriptive, kick them out of the house, tough love, harm reduction says, we can come from love and respect and collaboration and empower people, putting them in the driver's seat of their own relationship to their problem behaviors and supporting them in discovering their truth, what goals make sense to them, and an approach to positive change, which is uniquely tailored to that person rather than this other kind of one-size-fits-all. And P.S., the data, the science all supports this, and the data and science does not support that old approach.
Yeah, that's overwhelmingly true. Of course, it doesn't sound profound in any other domain of life, but somehow it does when we talk about it. Now, I know I have listeners that, despite, I just wrote a book with Stanton Peele called Outgrowing Addiction. They know my work, and they know the people that I've had on. We talk about this exhaustively, but still a lot of people who I'm really thrilled listen to the show, they still have a hard time grappling with some of these concepts. And like I said, I work in a high school, and when I was talking to some of the kids that I work with about balancing a budget, well, I work with some of them who, to think about balancing a budget also requires them to think about the fact that, they certainly don't have enough money to pay for the kinds of things they would need to think about in a budget. And so when I tell them, one thing you could do is simply observe the money that you're spending. Keep spending it on all the stupid stuff you're spending it on, but just check out what you're spending. Write it down or think about it. Another thing you can do is check out how much money are you taking in a month, and then maybe you could get to how much money that you want to save for something, or how much things will cost. Nobody has a problem with that. That seems, if I told somebody that I was doing that with kids that I work with, they would say, "Why are you telling me this? Obviously, that's what you should do." If people are believing the standard story about drugs, and that there's something wrong with them for doing them, and something wrong with them for not being able to adhere to the abstinence principle, then they just can't spend. Why would they want to spend that kind of attention looking at their lives and mapping it out? But there's another problem too, which is it's really hard to convince people that this sort of work is not maverick. It's there in the science, in the literature, and it's there in real life. But the dissonance is so real, and I know that, of course, you've run into that. So have you received a pushback, and or have you noticed some people who originally pushed back on your ideas coming into their own in this concept?
To be honest, I get very, very, very little pushback. I've actually been surprised by that. And it may be in part, I do a lot of public speaking. I do a lot of training. But, part of it is that I have a selected audience.
Right.
The folks that come out to see me or that invite me to speak with them. So that's part of it. First of all, I'm not an ideologue. Actually, this is another thing I want to say about harm reduction. Alan Marlatt, the guy that introduced me to harm reduction, he was one of the mental health professionals that brought it over around 1990 from Europe, where it was really born. He called the philosophy that is inherent in harm reduction compassionate pragmatism. And essentially, the way I understand that is that, compassion is what inspires us, is the impulse to be helpful, to reduce the suffering of another. Or we might even say to reduce our own suffering when we think about self-compassion, to be kind, to be helpful. But the pragmatic part is that we need to be continually testing our efforts, our theories, our policies against what works and what doesn't work. So, inherent in harm reduction approaches is a kind of practical, pragmatic, evidence-based, and I don't mean that just in terms of science, but really looking at what works and what doesn't. So and also when I give talks, I actually want to challenge the tendency in our field to be divisive. That's one of the problems in our field, that it's completely like where agree. Yeah. The field is in adolescence. Everybody's fighting with each other. Is it a disease? Is it trauma? Is it learning? Is it habit? Is it choice? Is it relationships? Is it social inequities? And in fact, I think it's all of those things for some people. It's some mix of those things for all people. So, and the fact is that most people really care and want to find solutions. So one of the ways that I pitch and frame anytime I talk about this is that this is a we problem. We as a nation, we as a community, we as mental health professionals, we as families, concerned families, just want to figure out how can we be more helpful to more people. And the fact is that what we've been doing has not been working for most people. It's been an abysmal failure, and I'll prove it. Let's think about that together. What do we know about that? Let's look at the evidence. The evidence is, the worst opioid and overdose crisis in history. The evidence is, hundreds of thousands of people incarcerated for nonviolent drug use and destroying their lives and their families and their communities. The evidence is a culture of stigma where, nobody wants, drug users to have treatment in their community, or nobody wants them to be working in their jobs, in their companies. I mean, it's just, the narratives about drug use are just destructive and wrong. So we need a new, more reasonable, more effective way of helping. And so I frame this also as harm reduction therapy extends the reach of all of these treatments and tries to pull them together in a more comprehensive, integrated way. That's part of how I think about my approach, integrative harm reduction therapy. Let's bring together, body-oriented approaches with psychological and relational approaches, with mindfulness, self-management approaches, with an attention to people's actual lives. I know this is something that Stanton and you, in the book really talk about. Having lives that are meaningful, that, that are worthwhile, that work for people, are going to motivate and support positive behavior change. So
you started this response with, "I'm not an ideologue," and I don't know if you remember now. That was following. I'm asking you, have you received a lot of pushback? And I'm just listening to you in real time. The reason I know that you're not just blindly following an ideology is because, there's evidence in just your speech. So I'm asking you, do you get pushback? And you're saying no, while at the same time you're scripting out loud why that might not be a good thing. Well, maybe I have a selective audience. And so just the way that you're talking about this is, it in no way compares to the therapeutic heuristics that you had mentioned earlier, which in some cases may work. Maybe treating addiction or problematic drug use as though it were some sort of disorder or disease is beneficial in some areas, but we need a more grand narrative about what we're dealing with, namely human beings. Now, I have run into people with certain kinds of ideas about what harm reduction is, and I see two problems. One is that it can be turned into something of an ideology. So just whether it's good, well-intended or not, and whether people are getting some things right or not, I can hear when I'm talking to people that they're just simply not interesting anymore. They're saying this, they're very predictable, and they're saying the same things over and over. So in that sense, that's sort of antithetical to what you're talking about, what harm reduction should be. On the other hand, there are people who I think are applying some sort of a method toward working with people, and it's not really harm reduction like you described. It's not really asking people what's going on in their lives and helping them think out what a path might be forward in minimal steps. So do you ever come across that sort of a problem?
Yeah, I what you say brings a few things to mind. One is sort of the downsides of harm reduction becoming more well-known and more accepted is that lots of people that are not necessarily ethical want to get in on the goods, right? Right. You may say that you're a harm reductionist when you have no idea what harm reduction is. There are unscrupulous people who are out there just trying to cash in using that term, who really haven't, sort of deeply understood, it in the way that we're talking about it today.
Can you think of specific examples of that? You don't have to throw anybody under the bus here, but just... Yeah,
okay. So, some people think that medication-assisted treatment is a harm reduction. It's a harm-reducing intervention, treatment for sure. We know that when people are on medication-assisted treatment, whether buprenorphine or methadone, people's lives are saved. It's a incredibly wonderful medication, life-saving. But many medication-assisted practitioners don't use these medications, these tools within a harm reduction framework. They use them within a context that is punitive, that is humiliating, that that disrupts people's lives. That requires that people jump through hoops, or they have a positive urine toxicology for cannabis, and they automatically have their dose either raised or in some cases get booted off the program. So, what might look like harm reduction on the one hand actually might be camouflaging very old school punitive ways of working with people. Or, on the other hand, some people make the claim that harm reduction is just giving people permission to get high.
Right.
So that's, but there are some people within the harm reduction world who essentially think of harm reduction that way. Like give somebody a clean syringe, give them a place to get high and hang out, and leave them alone. So they're erring on the side of, sort of human rights and activism, which I think are essential values of the harm reduction movement, but without really recognizing the complexity, embracing the complexity, that certainly the majority of drug users should be left alone to use their drugs in whatever way they want. I mean, the majority, we're all drug users. Let's face it, one side or another.
Yeah.
So, but what we're talking about is people that are using in problematic ways. And so just simply supplying equipment to use more safely runs the risk of not really responding to the complex needs that people have for much more than that, and then sort of consigning them to, no further help, no really individualized attention. Actually, I have a friend, colleague, Scott Kellogg, who calls that the harm reduction of despair.
Right, yeah.
And apparently this is part of the way harm reduction is done in Europe. It's now become so acceptable in certain communities. It's like, walking into, a government, social service office. Go get your syringes, and get out of here.
Yeah, okay. So it's like, on one hand, drugs themselves, just like they're not causing addictions, drugs themselves are not causing the disruption in people's lives. Drugs themselves also cannot ameliorate addictions. There has to be an element of human contact there. And similarly, being just more laissez-faire with rules, while that's really liberating, is just not going to always solve problems. If it did, then that should solve all of our problems. So I see what you mean. They're just, we have to inspect each situation as it comes up, I suppose is what you're saying.
And we might say that all of those really valuable public health interventions, syringe access, right, helping people with vein care if they're intravenous drug users, safer crack smoking kits, condom distribution, naloxone distribution, safer injection rooms, or safer consumption rooms. I think all of these are life-saving interventions. But if we just stop there, we lose incredible opportunities to engage people in much more quantum change. And so here's where I think harm reduction therapy and my approach, integrative harm reduction therapy, can sort of wrap those interventions in a therapeutic relationship, or potentially therapeutic relationship. So we can think about offering a syringe as being a point of contact,
right,
around which a relationship can be built,
right,
and that relationship then can support people in, using, staying healthy and alive as a first step toward creating the life that you really optimally want to be living in all aspects. So we have much more ambitious, aspirations for ourselves and the people that we're serving than simply stopping, there.
I'm laughing in the background because I just wrote an article for Filter magazine, and you just summed it up. I mean, you just went through the outline of the article, but it also took me a really long time to think about how to phrase. I wish I just had this talk with you before I wrote it. I know we're running short on time. I do want to talk about, even if briefly, the Center for Optimal Living and the kind of work you do and your colleagues do there.
Okay. Well, I wrote the book you mentioned, Harm Reduction Psychotherapy, a new treatment for drug and alcohol problems, back in 2002. And that led to international invitations to train people in this approach. So I had to develop a comprehensive training. So the invitations really contributed to the evolution of this complex approach to thinking about addiction or the spectrum of problematic behavior in a psychobiosocial way. That's a whole new paradigm shift, I think. And elaborating integrative harm reduction psychotherapy in terms of therapeutic tasks and particular skills and strategies. And now I've trained aspects of this in 17 countries around the world.
Wow.
But about 8 years ago, and I had been doing that mostly as a solo practitioner, but I thought that in order to better advance this work and really have an impact on the social narrative, to really change or help and contribute to changing the dominant narratives about addiction and how to help people change, I thought that there should be a platform that could really advance this in a much bigger way. And so that gave rise to the birth of the Center for Optimal Living 7.5 years ago in New York City. So we have a psychotherapy center, which in a way is like a showcase and a laboratory for the ongoing development of the work. So we've got 13 clinicians. We are now offering comprehensive treatment. What does harm reduction therapy look like in individual work, with groups, with families, with couples? And we have a whole systemic approach. So we're really working to engage families and partners as much as the, identified problem person. And then we've got a professional and organizational training arm where we then can support people in replicating the model in their own settings, either in their organizations or in their private practices, or, and now we've trained hundreds and hundreds of people that are bringing this work out, throughout the country.
Wow, I'm really interested to know more about that.
This past weekend, we had our last intensive 3-day training, and we had 25 people from 12 states around the United States. Like, I found that to be incredibly inspiring and mind-boggling, that people came from all over the country, to get this training and bring it back to Tennessee, Indiana, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Washington State, and more.
Are there people looking for this sort of guidance in institutions that you're surprised they work in? Like, maybe are there people from schools or things like that where you wouldn't have expected?
Yes. Well, this is the silver lining in, this very dark period with our, so-called opioid crisis.
Right.
And meanwhile, we've got lots of problem drinking escalating and lots of other drug use escalating. I think that there is a basis for suggesting that we have over 100 million people in this country engaging in some kind of problematic use,
right,
of one thing or another. That's like almost a third of the country. And most of those people actually don't want to stop, and most of them don't even want to take action around change. And
you're just talking about psychoactive drugs, right? We're not even getting into just behaviors and experiences that people are involved in that they don't want to stop.
That's right. So, it's mind-boggling. We might even think that, and this is actually an idea that I've started to really elaborate, that what we call addiction is actually related to an experience that is actually universally human.
Right.
And if we really think about that, then maybe that will help us destigmatize the people that we call addicts and realize that actually we're all, subject to the same kind of dynamics. But to get back to your specific question, in the face of this, these crises, I think they're shaking a lot of people out of, their old complacency and out of their adherence to these old ideas. So, yeah, I'm finding that people in mainstream America, in mainstream government, in, state governments and local governments, and lots of people in traditional recovery kind of addiction treatment centers, are realizing that what we've been doing has not been helping, and they're opening up to sort of to find new, cutting edge, more exciting and hopeful alternatives. And so the attention is starting to turn toward this stuff. In the last year, I've been invited to speak at opioid summits in New Hampshire, in Bloomington, Indiana, in Portland, Maine. So there's something really positive happening where kind of the network is starting to expand to include people that had been in kind of warring camps. So I've, have been feeling increasingly hopeful that, this work is starting to really be embraced by the mainstream more and more.
That's good news. Now, I know we just have a couple minutes left and you've got to head out. I will have spoken about this in the intro, but are you involved in the Families for Sensible Drug Policy event that they're hosting in February?
Yeah, I'm certainly a big supporter. In fact, I've been on the advisory board. I've, been a strong supporter since Carol first founded FSDP. And, I hope to participate in that event. I don't know if, I don't imagine this would be problematic, but Carol has recently invited me actually to be part of the executive board.
Wow.
And so I'm going to accept that, graciously, feel honored to be, formally a part of the organization and help support its growth and impact.
Excellent. Well, congratulations and thank you.
It's my pleasure, really, deep pleasure.
Where can I send people to access more of your work or hear more from you?
Well, they can visit my center website, which is centerforoptimalliving.com. They can also visit my personal website, which has some other material on it, andrewtatarsky.com, Tatarsky. On our website, there are a number of papers that people can download for free on the media tab. Oh, and there's something that people might really be interested in. We've applied our therapeutic tasks to a self-guided change process that we call the 6-step guide to positive change. You can find that guide on the homepage. It's free, and it really walks people through 6 steps that they can work through a number of exercises and different kinds of things to clarify one's ideal drug use plan, substance use plan, and work toward implementing it. So lots of people have found that to be really useful, and I would invite people to check it out. And people can sign up for our mailing list, and people can email me directly. I'm always happy to be in conversation with folks, to hear, what's happening out there in the field, and to collaborate with like-minded folks.
Excellent. Thank you. And of course, I'll link to everything in the show notes. Andrew Tatarsky, this talk has been a pleasure. Thank you again for your lifelong efforts, and thanks for joining me today.
It's really a pleasure, and thanks for inviting me. And I hope, to have more conversations in the future.